New images from space reveal a pattern. No one expected. Something is wrong with the way we have been looking at the universe. For generations, we pointed our telescopes toward the night sky, believing we were witnessing chaos unfolding across an infinite void. Galaxies scattered like dust, light traveling without purpose, a cosmos shaped by blind forces, indifferent to structure, indifferent to meaning. That belief felt safe, predictable, scientific. But now, something has begun to break that illusion. New images captured from deep space are revealing structures that should not exist in the way they do. Not because they are impossible, but because they are repeating, quietly, persistently, across distances so vast that the human mind struggles to comprehend them. At first, no one paid attention. A coincidence, perhaps, a visual artifact, a trick of perspective. But then it appeared again, and again. Patterns began to surface in places where randomness was expected. Alignments stretching across millions of light years, filaments connecting galaxies in ways that feel less like chaos and more like intention, structures that seem to echo themselves, as if the universe is following a hidden blueprint. And the deeper we look, the more unsettling the question becomes. What if the universe is not random? What if, beneath everything we see, there is an order we were never meant to notice? In this journey, we are not just going to look at images from space. We are going to confront something far more profound. The possibility that the universe is not simply expanding, but organizing. That what we thought was noise might actually be a signal. And that somewhere within these patterns lies a clue, not only about the cosmos, but about our own existence. Because when the universe begins to repeat itself, it stops being background. It becomes a message. The disturbance. Look closely at these images, not as a scientist, not as an observer, but as someone trying to recognize something familiar without knowing why. At first, you see what you expect to see: clusters of galaxies, threads of light, vast regions of darkness separating islands of matter across an endless expanse. It feels distant, abstract, almost impossible to relate to. But then something shifts. Your eyes begin to follow the lines, not randomly but instinctively, from one cluster to another, from one filament to the next. And suddenly, what seemed chaotic begins to feel connected. There is a rhythm hidden inside the silence. Structures repeat their shapes, patterns stretch, bend, and mirror themselves across scales that should have no relation to one another. It is not perfect symmetry. It is something more subtle, a kind of consistency that should not exist in a universe governed only by randomness. Why do these structures align the way they do? Why do distant regions of space seem to follow similar geometric behaviors, even when separated by billions of light years? And more importantly, why does it feel familiar? There is something deeply unsettling about recognizing a pattern you were never taught to see. Something that makes you question whether you are discovering it for the first time or remembering it from somewhere deeper. Because if this is just coincidence, it is the kind of coincidence that repeats with precision. And if it is not coincidence, then we are looking at something far more profound than a collection of galaxies. We are looking at structure, not imposed from the outside, but emerging from within the universe itself. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The assumption we all shared. Before these images, before these questions, there was a quiet agreement we all accepted without resistance. The universe was random, not completely chaotic, of course. There were laws, gravity pulling matter together, physics shaping motion, energy, and time. But beyond those rules, there was no deeper intention, no hidden design, no reason for structure beyond what natural forces could explain. Galaxies formed where matter happened to gather. Stars ignited where conditions allowed. Everything we saw was the result of processes unfolding blindly, without direction, without purpose. This idea became the foundation of how we interpret reality. When we looked at the night sky, we were not searching for patterns. We were confirming randomness. Every irregularity reinforced what we already believed. Every cluster, every void, every scattered formation became evidence that the universe was exactly what we expected it to be. Unpredictable, indifferent, unstructured beyond necessity. And because we believed this so deeply, we stopped questioning it. We stopped asking whether the patterns we dismissed were actually signals. We stopped considering that repetition might mean something. We trained our minds to see disorder, even when something more subtle was trying to reveal itself. Because seeing order where none is expected is uncomfortable. It forces a shift, a reevaluation, a confrontation with the possibility that we have misunderstood something fundamental. And that is exactly where we find ourselves now. Because these new images do not fit neatly into the story we have been telling. They do not behave like random distributions of matter shaped only by gravity. They suggest something more coherent, more connected, not perfectly ordered, but not truly random either. Something in between, something we were never trained to recognize. And now that it is becoming visible, the question is no longer whether the universe follows laws. The question is whether those laws are guiding something far more structured than we ever imagined. The moment everything felt off. It did not begin with a discovery. There was no announcement, no sudden revelation that shook the scientific world overnight. It started quietly, almost invisibly, inside the routine work of analyzing data that, at first glance, seemed ordinary. Images were being processed, maps were being refined, observations collected over years were finally reaching a level of clarity never seen before. And then, something subtle appeared. Not something dramatic, not something that immediately demanded attention, just a small inconsistency, a repetition where there should have been variation, a structure that seemed to echo another, far beyond the distance where any connection should exist. At first, it was ignored. It looked like coincidence, a statistical fluke, the kind of thing that appears in large data sets when you look long enough. The human brain is wired to find patterns, even where none exist. That was the assumption, so it was dismissed. But then it appeared again, in a different region, under different conditions, measured by different instruments, the same kind of alignment, the same subtle repetition, the same quiet suggestion that something was not behaving the way randomness should behave. And this is where the discomfort began. Because coincidence does not repeat with consistency. Randomness does not organize itself in ways that feel intentional. Researchers began to look more closely, not because they were searching for something extraordinary, but because they could no longer ignore what was already there. The more they examined, the clearer it became. These were not isolated anomalies. They were part of a pattern that stretched across vast cosmic distances, a pattern that connected structures that should have been independent, a pattern that seemed to follow rules that had not yet been defined. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether something unusual had been observed. The question became far more unsettling. How long has this been there, unnoticed? Because if this pattern was always present, hidden within the data, then it means we were not discovering something new. We were correcting something we misunderstood, and that realization changes everything. The pattern begins to emerge. Once the anomaly could no longer be ignored, something changed in the way these images were being seen. It was no longer about observing isolated regions of space. It became about stepping back, expanding the perspective, connecting what had always been analyzed separately. And that is when the pattern stopped being subtle. From a distance, the universe began to resemble something strangely familiar. Not a random scattering of galaxies, but a network. Filaments stretching like threads, connecting massive clusters across unimaginable distances. Voids forming between them, not as empty accidents, but as part of a larger structure. But the deeper you look, the more unsettling it becomes. Zoom in, and the same behavior appears again. Smaller structures reflecting the same organization. Not identical, not perfectly symmetrical, but consistent in a way that feels deliberate. Zoom out, and the pattern holds. Zoom in, and it repeats. It is as if the universe is not just expanding outward, but building itself using the same underlying logic at every scale. A quiet echo running through everything. This is where the mind begins to struggle. Because randomness does not scale like this. Randomness produces irregularity, noise, unpredictability. But what we are seeing here is something different. Something that maintains a kind of structural memory, even as it stretches across billions of light years. And the more this idea settles in, the harder it becomes to ignore what it implies. This is not a single pattern. It is a behavior, a way in which the universe organizes itself. And once you recognize that, a deeper question begins to form, almost against your will. If the same structure appears across different scales, then what is actually repeating? Is it the matter itself, or is it the rules behind it? Because if the rules are repeating, then what we are witnessing is not just structure in space. We are witnessing a pattern in reality itself. And that leads us directly into a question most people are not prepared to face. The uncomfortable question. There is a moment in every discovery when the data is no longer the problem. The problem becomes the question. Because once the pattern is visible, once repetition can no longer be explained away as coincidence, the mind is forced into a place it resists, a place where the old assumptions no longer hold. And this is where the question begins to take shape, slowly, almost reluctantly. What if the universe is not random, not partially random, not mostly random, but fundamentally structured in a way we have not yet understood? This is not a small adjustment to our understanding. This is a shift in perspective that touches everything. Because randomness has always been the background assumption, the silent foundation beneath modern cosmology. Remove that, and the entire interpretation of reality begins to move. Because if structure exists at this level, repeating across scales, connecting regions that should be independent, then what we are seeing is not just the result of physical laws acting blindly. We are seeing coherence, and coherence suggests something deeper than interaction. It suggests organization. Now, this does not mean intention. It does not mean design in the way the human mind wants to interpret it. But it does mean that the universe may be following a logic that is not limited to what we currently understand as cause and effect. A logic that allows patterns to emerge consistently, even across distances where no direct influence should exist. And that is where the discomfort intensifies. Because if this is true, then the universe is not just a collection of objects interacting through forces. It is a system that behaves as a whole, a system where parts reflect the structure of the whole, even when separated by billions of light years. And once that idea enters your mind, it becomes difficult to ignore its implications. Because if the universe behaves like a unified system, then the separation we perceive between things may not be as real as we think. What we call distance may not mean disconnection. What we call randomness may be something we simply do not recognize yet. And that leads to a question that changes the way you look at everything. If the universe is structured at every level, what kind of structure are we living inside? What science can explain and what it cannot? At this point, it would be easy to assume that science has already solved this. After all, we understand gravity, we understand how matter behaves, we have mapped galaxies, measured cosmic radiation, and traced the evolution of the universe from its earliest moments. So the natural response is simple. There must be an explanation. And in part, there is. Gravity pulls matter together, forming clusters of galaxies. Dark matter, invisible yet dominant, creates the scaffolding that allows these structures to emerge. Over billions of years, small fluctuations in the early universe grew into the vast cosmic web we observe today. Filaments, clusters, and voids are not unexpected. They are predicted. But this is where the explanation begins to lose its grip. Because what we are seeing is not just structure, it is repetition. Physics explains why galaxies group together. It explains why filaments form. It explains the general architecture of the universe. But it does not fully explain why similar patterns appear across vastly different regions with such consistency. It does not predict this level of structural echo. It does not account for the feeling that the universe is following a deeper order beyond what current models describe. And that distinction matters, because explaining formation is not the same as explaining behavior. Science can tell us how something begins. But here, we are confronting how something continues. Why does the universe maintain this kind of organization as it evolves? Why do patterns persist instead of dissolving into randomness over time? Why does structure seem to reinforce itself rather than break apart? These are not failures of science. They are boundaries, edges where our current understanding reaches its limit and begins to blur. And this is not unusual. Every major breakthrough in science has emerged from moments like this, where the existing models were not wrong, but incomplete, where something subtle did not fit. And instead of forcing it to fit, the only option was to expand the way we think. That is where we are now, standing at the edge of explanation, looking at something that is partially understood yet deeply unresolved. Because what we are observing is not contradicting physics. It is revealing that physics may be part of a larger framework we have not yet fully seen. And when that realization begins to settle in, the mind naturally moves toward possibilities, not conclusions, possibilities. The three possibilities. When understanding reaches its limit, the mind does something inevitable. It begins to imagine what lies beyond it, not as fantasy, but as an attempt to extend logic into the unknown, to take what we know and carefully step into what we do not. And from this edge, three possibilities begin to emerge. The first is the most grounded, the most familiar. There are laws we have not yet discovered. The universe may be behaving exactly as it should, following rules that are perfectly consistent, but still invisible to us. Just as gravity once shaped the world before it was understood, there may be deeper principles guiding these patterns, hidden beneath the surface of what we can currently measure. In this view, the repetition we are seeing is not mysterious. It is incomplete knowledge, and history supports this idea. Every time something seemed unexplainable, the answer was not magic, but a deeper layer of physics waiting to be revealed. But there is a second possibility, and it is more unsettling. What if the universe is not just following rules, but organizing itself? Not consciously, not intentionally, but through a kind of emergent behavior, where complexity gives rise to structure in ways that are not directly programmed, yet not entirely random. We see this in nature, in the way snowflakes form, in the branching of rivers, in the networks inside the human brain. Systems that begin with simple rules, yet evolve into patterns of extraordinary complexity and coherence. If this is happening at a cosmic scale, then the universe is not just expanding, it is developing. And that leads to the third possibility, the one that is hardest to confront. What if what we are seeing is not the full picture? What if the visible universe is only a projection, a surface expression of something deeper, more fundamental, and more structured than we can perceive? In this case, the patterns we observe would not originate in space itself. They would be reflections of a deeper layer of reality, shaping everything from beneath, like a hidden architecture casting shadows into the observable universe. And what we call structure would not be created within the universe. It would be inherited from something beyond it. None of these possibilities can be confirmed yet. None of them can be dismissed, but each one leads to the same realization. What we are observing is not trivial. It is not a minor detail hidden in astronomical data. It is a doorway, a signal that something about our understanding of the universe is still incomplete. And once that door is open, there is no going back to seeing the cosmos as something simple. Because now every pattern you see carries a question, and that question does not stop at the stars. The fractal revelation. There is a moment when observation turns into recognition, not because something new appears, but because something familiar reveals itself in a place where it should not exist. This is that moment. Look at the structure of the universe again, but this time, do not think of it as distant. Do not think of it as something separate from everything you already know. Instead, compare it. The branching filaments connecting galaxies begin to resemble something else. Not perfectly, not identically, but in a way that feels unmistakable. A pattern that repeats, not in detail, but in behavior. You have seen this before, in the way lightning spreads across the sky, dividing into smaller and smaller paths, yet maintaining the same structure at every scale. In the way rivers carve their way through the land, forming networks that mirror themselves as they expand. In the intricate connections of neurons inside the human brain, where signals travel through pathways that echo the same branching logic. Different systems, different materials, different scales, the same underlying pattern. This is where the idea becomes difficult to ignore, because if these structures emerge independently in environments that have no direct connection to each other, then what is actually repeating? It is not the substance, it is the form, a kind of structural language that appears wherever complexity is allowed to grow, a way in which systems organize themselves, regardless of whether they are made of water, energy, matter, or thought. And now, that same language appears in the largest structure we can observe, the universe itself. This is not coincidence in the way we normally understand it. It is not random similarity. It is consistency across reality, expressed through different scales and different forms. And that forces a shift in perspective, because the universe is no longer something that simply exists at a distance. It begins to feel connected to everything else, to nature, to biology, even to the patterns of thought inside your own mind, as if the same principles that shape galaxies are present in some form within everything. And if that is true, then the universe is not just a place where patterns happen. It is a system where patterns repeat. Not because they are copied, but because they are fundamental. And once you begin to see reality this way, a deeper realization starts to form. What we call complexity may not be chaos. It may be order, expressed in a language we are only beginning to understand. Why this changes everything. If these patterns were isolated, they would be interesting. If they were rare, they would be anomalies. But they are neither. They appear consistently. They persist across scales. They connect regions of reality that should have no direct relationship. And that changes the meaning of what we are looking at. Because this is no longer just about space. It is about structure itself. For a long time, we believed that order was something local, something that emerged under specific conditions, a temporary arrangement in an otherwise indifferent universe. But if the same patterns appear everywhere, then order is not local. It is universal. And that realization shifts everything, because a universe that contains order is very different from a universe that is built on order. In the first, structure is an exception. In the second, structure is the rule. And if structure is the rule, then randomness is not the foundation we thought it was. It may still exist, but it operates within boundaries, within a framework that guides how matter, energy, and even time itself evolve. This means that what we are observing is not just the result of forces interacting. It is the expression of a deeper coherence, a kind of consistency that shapes the behavior of the universe at every level. And once you accept that possibility, something else begins to shift. Your place within it. Because if the same structural principles that shape galaxies also appear in nature, in biological systems, even in the way networks form and evolve, then the separation between you and the cosmos begins to dissolve. You are not standing outside, observing a distant universe. You are inside a system that follows the same rules everywhere. The same logic that connects galaxies may also be present in the patterns of your thoughts, your decisions, your life. Not in a mystical sense, but in a structural one. And that changes the way you see everything, because the universe is no longer just a backdrop. It becomes a process, a system unfolding, organizing, repeating, and you are not separate from it. You are part of that unfolding. The human connection. Now the question is no longer out there. It turns inward. Because once you recognize that patterns are not confined to distant galaxies, once you see that the same structural language appears across reality, it becomes impossible to ignore where else it might exist. Inside you. Think about the way your thoughts move. They do not appear randomly. They follow paths. One idea leads to another, forming connections that strengthen over time. Certain patterns repeat. Certain reactions return. Certain ways of seeing the world reinforce themselves, shaping how you experience reality. This is not chaos. It is structure. Your brain is not just a collection of cells firing without direction. It is a network, constantly reorganizing, constantly adapting, following principles that are strikingly similar to the ones we observe at much larger scales. Connections form, pathways strengthen, patterns emerge, and the more they repeat, the more real they become. The same is true in your life. Habits form through repetition. Decisions create trajectories. Small actions, repeated over time, shape outcomes that feel inevitable. What begins as possibility becomes pattern. What becomes pattern begins to define reality. And suddenly, the distance between you and the universe begins to disappear. Because what you are seeing in space is not completely foreign. It is familiar, not in detail, but in behavior. The universe connects. The universe organizes. The universe repeats. And so do you. This is where the realization becomes personal. Because if the same structural principles exist at every level, then understanding the universe is not just about looking outward. It is also about recognizing what is already happening within you. You are not separate from this system. You are an expression of it, a localized version of the same processes that shape galaxies and cosmic networks, unfolding at a different scale, but following the same underlying logic. And once you see that, a new question begins to form. Not about the universe, but about yourself. If you are part of a system built on patterns, what patterns are shaping your reality? The final question. There is a point where information stops being enough, where facts, images, and explanations no longer satisfy the deeper tension that has been building since the beginning. Because this was never just about what we see in space. It was about what those observations imply. You began by looking at distant structures, patterns forming across unimaginable distances. You followed the threads, the alignments, the repetitions that should not exist in a universe governed only by randomness. You questioned what you believed. You explored what science can explain and where its boundaries begin to blur. You considered possibilities that stretch beyond current understanding. And somewhere along this journey, something shifted. The universe stopped feeling distant. It became connected. Now you are left with something far more powerful than an answer. You are left with a question that does not close, but expands. Because if the universe repeats itself, if the same structures appear across scales, if the same patterns shape galaxies, nature, and even the way you think, then what you are looking at is not just a collection of objects. It is a system that includes you, and that leads to a realization that cannot be ignored. You are not simply observing the universe. You are part of the pattern you are trying to understand. And that changes the nature of the question entirely, because it is no longer about what is out there. It is about what this means for everything. Are we discovering the universe for the first time? Or are we slowly recognizing something we have always been part of?